Hey, good evening and a warm welcome to yet another biography event. My name is Kai Bird and I am the director of the Leon Levy Center for Biography, a wholly unique institution hosted by the Graduate Center of the City University of New York and founded by Shelby White and the Leon Levy Foundation in the year 2007. I want to thank Shelby for her steadfast support to the Biography Center. It is her vision that makes this program possible. While the Graduate Center at CUNY is now open for classes, we are not allowed to hold any public events in the auditoriums. So this autumn semester, all our Leon Levy events will be on Zoom. Please note that we have 3 events this week. Tomorrow evening, November 10th, we will be honored to host the acclaimed British biographer Claire Tomalin. She will be discussing her new biography on H.G. Wells with Edward Mendelsohn. But please note that this event will start at 5 p.m. Eastern Time, not 6 p.m., because Tomalin will be speaking to us from England. And it gets very late there. And the very next evening, on Thursday, November 11th, Julia Zweig will be talking about her biography of Lady Bird Johnson with Pulitzer Prize winner Debbie Applegate. And on November 10th, the celebrated English anyway, please, I've just talked about Claire Tomalin. Please mark your calendars and register for these events on the Leon Levy website. And please encourage your friends and relatives to subscribe to our digital mailing list on our website. But tonight we are here to discuss Jason Riley's book, Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. Riley will be in conversation with Robert George. Thomas Sowell is now 91 years old, and he has written more than 30 books. His writings have frequently challenged liberal orthodoxy, and so not surprisingly, Sowell is often regarded as a controversial intellectual. So we should be in for an interesting discussion. Jason Riley is a senior fellow at the Manhattan Institute and a columnist for the Wall Street Journal. After joining the journal in 1994, Mr. Riley was named a senior editorial page writer in 2000 and a member of the editorial board in 2005. He joined the Manhattan Institute of Public Policy think tank in 2015. Mr. Riley is the author of 3 other books: Let Them In, The Case for Open Doors, Please Stop Helping Us, How Liberals Make It Harder for Blacks to Succeed, and False Black Power, published in 2017. Robert George is a member of the Bloomberg Opinion Editorial Board and a columnist. Previously, he was a member of the New York Post and Daily News editorial boards, and he has been writing about New York and national issues for more than 2 decades. He was born in Trinidad, and he was a graduate of St. John's College in Annapolis, Maryland. George worked for the Republican National Committee and following the 1994 midterm elections, he worked for Speaker of the House, Newt Gingrich. George has been a guest on MSNBC, CNN, and Fox News. He has written for the Conservative National Review, the Libertarian Reason, and the Progressive Huffington Post. In addition, George moonlights as a stand-up comic. I thought that was an interesting aspect of his biography. So please look for Maverick at bookshops.org, a site that will lead you to your local independent bookstore. Jason and Robert will be in conversation for about 40 minutes, and then we will take questions from our virtual audience. Please click on the question box below to type in your questions, and Robert will be sure to get to as many as he can. We will try to end this program after about 1 hour. Again, thanks to the Leon Levy Foundation for funding this and all our events. And now I turn this conversation over to Robert George. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Kai. I very much appreciate you putting this together for us. This is a conversation I've been looking forward to for quite some time. not the least of which is because Jason and I can finally disprove the notion to many people that we are indeed the same person. We are actually two different people, and there's no trick photography that's going on here, even though we are both Black conservatives with similar hairstyles and so forth. To help ease the confusion tonight, Jason opted to go the pandemic look without a tie, and I decided to go with the tie anyway. So, so Jason, thanks so much. Thanks so much for you doing this. So let's get right into it. Let's literally start from the beginning. You've got the title. The title of this biography of Thomas Sowell is "The Maverick." And many people who follow politics may know that John McCain was nicknamed the Maverick, but there's not exactly a lot of similarity there. Why the title? Let's start with that.
Sure, and thank you and the Levy Center for doing this. And Robert, I appreciate you taking this on. The title is a reference to Sowell's intellectual maverick aspect. That's what I was getting at with the title. He is a maverick and has distinguished himself, I think, in ways that ought not distinguish you as an intellectual, but sadly today does. Telling the truth, following the facts where they lead, and reporting the findings, even when they're politically incorrect or unpopular. That is something that Sowell has spent a career doing, whether he's writing about social theory, or political philosophy, race and ethnicity, you name it. He's someone who's put truth above popularity. And as I said, unfortunately today, that makes you something of an intellectual maverick. And we can get into some examples of that, but that is where the title came from.
One of the things that comes out in this biography, and what I think is rather interesting in terms of the way you approach this, this is not going to be the biography where you're going to open it up and it's going to say, well, the subject was born in 19 something, 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 and then he went to school here, and then he went to school there, and so forth. This seems to be as much a biography of Sowell's ideas as it is of the man, and it seems that the chapters seem to kind of break it down that way. So why did you use that approach to, in a sense, introduce the broader public to Thomas Sowell?
Well, for two reasons. One is Sowell is proudest of his ideas, and that's what he wants to be remembered for, not his life story, which of course I think is necessary to tell, to find out where those ideas came from in some respects. But yes, this is largely an intellectual biography, and so that is the focus on his legacy as a public intellectual, his ideas, how he'll be remembered, and so forth. The other reason I chose to go that route is because Sowell had already written a memoir back in 2000 called A Personal Odyssey, and he'd also published a book of correspondence called A Man of Letters in the mid-2000s, and I draw from both works to sort of round out this analysis of his ideas. But if people wanted a deep dive into his personal life, they could get it there. So what I was kind of surprised at is that Sowell didn't have a biographer. Someone who had written about his ideas. I think he deserved biographical treatment, not just because of his sort of iconoclastic writings on race and ethnicity, but even if Sowell had never written a single word about, say, affirmative action, I think he would have been worthy of biographical treatment from his writings on social theory and political philosophy and intellectual history. And I was quite shocked that he didn't already have one. And I soon came to learn that he didn't particularly want one, Robert. It was when I first approached him about this, it had to be a dozen years ago. He was quite dismissive of it. And So it took some goading, and he's 91 years old now. So maybe I just wore him down in his dotage, but he finally gave in. It took a lot of urging from me and some others who said, you might as well let Jason write this book, Tom. Someone's going to write it.
So does this count as an authorized biography or an unauthorized biography or a cajoled biography?
Maybe cajoled. He cooperated. He did sit for some very long interviews for the biography, but it's not authorized in the sense that he got to sign off on the eventual product. So no, not in that sense.
In the let's see, in the chapter of Sowell's reconsiderations, you quote him here. These are Sowell's words. One of the curious facts about the classical economists is that most of them were members of minority groups. Minorities not simply in some numerical sense, but in some ways that were in ways that were socially relevant. And then he talks about being a Scotsman was not an incidental fact in the England of Adam Smith's day. Malthus, the two Mills, J.R. McCulloch were also Scottish, and so forth. What jumped out at me is you introduced this quote of his with this line, and then we got this Sowellian insight, which sounds like a cross between Socrates and Orwell. But I'm kind of curious, how would you define Sowellian insight?
What I meant in that phrase was that Tom was obviously not the first person to study the classical liberals. and yet he found something to say about them, or some way to say something about them that others had not. There was a unique insight. He looked at the same material that others had looked at and found something new to say or interesting to say. And he's done that throughout his career. Sowell is an economist. I'm sorry. Did I lose Robert?
Sunday.
No, go ahead. I think somebody forgot to mute themselves. That's all. So go ahead. Keep going ahead, Jason, please.
Okay. Sowell's first discipline is economics and intellectual history. He got his PhD from the University of Chicago in history of economic thought and history of ideas, studying under George Stigler and Milton Friedman, two Nobel Prize winning economists. And when he was working on his dissertation, both of those guys were on his dissertation committee, and Stigler in particular, who was the expert on the history of economic thought in the country, if not the world, and told Tom to find another dissertation topic. Tom wanted to write something on John Baptiste Say, who's known for Say's law, a sort of basic economic concept coming out of that classical liberal school. And Tom said, no, I want to do it. I want to do it on this. And Stigler basically said, a lot's already been said about this. So this would be like an English major saying, I want to do my dissertation on Macbeth. I've got something unique to say about Macbeth. And the teacher saying, oh, I'm sure you do, but you have to understand that a lot has already been written about that. Sowell plugged ahead. He went ahead and did it anyways, over Stigler's objections, and found something unique and interesting to say. And in the subsequent books that he wrote on the topic, partly based on this dissertation, the reviewers acknowledged as much. And the reason I went there in that chapter and discussed this earlier work is because, as I said, if Tom had never written a word about these racial and ethnic controversial subjects that he's best known for, he could have spent a career writing about his first love, his first discipline, which was studying those classical economic thinkers, Adam Smith's and John Stuart Mill's and David Ricardo's and so forth. That is where his real expertise lies.
When you read through this book, you might come away, at least let's say that we rephrase that. I sort of came away with the idea that in Sowell seems to be often struggling with himself in what direction he wants to go, because there are times it's not just because he goes from a number of colleges, a number of universities, kind of one after the other, but there also seems to be a struggle as to whether he wants to be an academic, or does he want to be a public intellectual? Does he stay focused on the economist track? Does he engage with the racial issues? Can you kind of discuss how these various tensions sort of influenced him on his path?
Sure. So Tom's first love was teaching, classroom teaching. I think he wanted to live out his days as a college professor of economics, full stop. Not writing books, not researching, teaching economics. That was his first love, preferably at a smaller school where you could get to know and interact with students. The problem was that he set about this career in the 1960s, and higher education was going through tremendous transformations in the 1960s. You had a women's rights movement, a gay rights movement, an anti-war movement, a civil rights movement, and all of these movements found platforms on college campuses. And Sowell was sort of an old school type. He wanted to teach the way he had been taught. And that was increasingly difficult to do on a college campus in the 1960s. So Tom taught at Rutgers. He taught at Howard University, the Black college in Washington, D.C. He taught at Cornell. And that at Cornell in the late 60s, I think, is where things really came to a head with the armed student protests, the takeover of student buildings on campus, and how the administrators and the faculty just completely capitulated to the demands of these radical students. And Tom was really disgusted at what he saw taking place. I mean, as I said, he was a very old school type. I'm here to teach economics. You're here to learn economics. No, you cannot be excused from class to go to an anti-war rally. No, we're not going to spend the whole class discussing the latest headlines in the newspapers. He didn't grade on the curve. And as a result, there were constant run-ins with fellow faculty members, administrators over his hard grading, and so forth. And I think it all came to a head with those student protests in the 1960s at Cornell. And after that, Tom continued to teach throughout the 70s. He taught at Amherst, he taught at Brandeis, he taught at UCLA, where he received tenure. He could have taught anywhere. He was a hugely accomplished, published everywhere. He was a very, very talented scholar, academic scholar. And but I think again, the zeitgeist just was not on his side. And so when the Hoover Institution offered him a position, and Hoover is based at Stanford University in California, when they offered him a position as a scholar in residence with no teaching duties, no office hours, he could just write and research, he jumped at it. And that was in 1980, and that's where he's been ever since. And there's been a trade-off here. I interviewed people for the book who said they wish Sowell had stuck it out in teaching despite his frustrations. He would have had, thousands of graduate students. Maybe we'd have a lot more people out there who think like Thomas Sowell. Instead, he's holed himself up at Hoover for all these decades. And instead, we have all the books and all the columns. Now, personally, I wouldn't give anything for all those books and columns. Those are what drew me to Tom. But there has been a trade-off in his career choice there.
It's safe to say, I think the way you just explained it kind of underscores this. Dr. Sowell is not somebody who suffers fools gladly. Could it be considered a tragic flaw in the classical sense of that phrase, that he wasn't willing to compromise more with either the changing times or with colleagues at institutions, that he could have indeed, as you say, had more influence on the academic side if he had decided to try and find a happy medium between where those times were going and where his core was?
I don't know that. I don't think so. No, I disagree. And here's why. and you'll probably recall this as well, but back in the 1980s and even into the early 90s, there were a number of Black scholars, Black thinkers. I'm thinking people like William Julius Wilson, Orlando Patterson, Stephen Carter, Randall Kennedy, who were saying, they weren't conservatives. They weren't replicas of Tom Sowell. I mean, Sowell is sui generis, but they were challenging a lot of the civil rights orthodoxy on a lot of matters of race. And there were more of them. Glenn Lowry was in this group as well. And as time went by, a lot of them stopped saying the types of things they were saying, or they turned to other topics, and I'm sure every one of those guys has their reasons for doing that, but they didn't stick it out like a Tom Sowell did. And when I asked some other people about this, they said, well, Jason, one thing all those guys have in common is they're academics, and they wanted to stay in the academy. And it's very hard to be the type of iconoclastic thinker, the type of maverick, the type of person who goes against the grain of the academy. And the academy was getting, was moving more in the direction in terms of less tolerance of independent thinkers. And you can see where it is today, people getting canceled and so forth. But that was starting already back in the 1980s and 90s. So I think there would have been a tremendous trade-off in Tom to really zip it if he wanted to stay on good terms with the folks in the faculty lounge. And I don't think he had the temperament to do that. And frankly, I'm glad he didn't do it. I mean, we wouldn't have the body of work that we have if he had decided to do that. So I don't know that I'd call it a flaw. I'm glad he stuck to his guns and went his own way, and I think the body of work that we have as a result of that, I'd much rather have than Tom Sowell, the professor, who just stayed in his lane.
No, that's perfectly acceptable. And of course, tragic flaw was most definitely my phrase. But I was really struck, though, as you said, the trade-off that we ended up with. So speaking of that, you used the phrase, temperament, and there was another instance that seems to be apropos to take a quick look at one of the passages here. Trigger warning is going to be, I'm going to make a reference to a certain word. I'm not going to say the word, but I am going to make a reference to it in here. So it's 1980. Ronald Reagan has won the election. And Thomas Sowell is under consideration to be Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. And the general counsel of the NAACP said, "We would view with considerable concern the appointment of Tom Sowell to HUD, or for that matter, to any other cabinet position. He would play the same kind of role that historically the House N-word played for the plantation owners. He could mete out the straight discipline, no matter how inhumanely administered, it would be presumed more acceptable because the hands of the disciplinarian are Black." Thomas Sowell responded to this, asked by the Washington Post his reaction, and he says, "I think the NAACP are the classic House word." And the word, unlike today, was actually printed. So number one, what does that say? How would you describe that kind of temperament that Thomas Sowell sort of, in a sense, gives as hard as he gets? Number one. And number two, what does it say about our, just in terms of where we are in contemporary times, that, as harsh as that word is, people in the public setting didn't shy away from using it in terms of making hard-edged political points.
Well, I mean, the second point there, I mean, we could have a whole conversation about that and the thin-skinnedness, the inability to, that people can listen to music with that word all day long, but if the wrong person says it in a different setting,
if a person references the lyrics in the song, but they don't censor themselves, they get
yeah, I mean, that's a whole separate conversation.
Run off from society, yes.
But it goes to show, I mean, you and I have both been on the receiving end of the same types of criticism from the same types of people, frankly. Once or twice. But it's so on one sense, it's just tells you how long this has been going on.
I just tell them I'm not Jason Riley.
Right, exactly. But this goes to part of the reason I wanted to write the book. I thought it was a shame that names like Ta-Nehisi Coates and Cornel West and Nicole Hannah-Jones and Ibram Kendi are better known than Tom Sowell. I think he is someone who has written circles around those individuals, maybe around all of them put together, Robert, frankly. And it's not just the range of topics he's covered, but I don't think they can match the depth and the rigor of Tom's thinking on these topics. And the reason those folks are better known than Sowell is because Sowell was, to use today's term, canceled a long time ago. The political left, the civil rights organizations, in the 1970s, when Tom started writing about these racial controversies, got him canceled. They went to the mainstream media. They said he is not someone who should be seen as speaking on behalf of most Blacks. And these are the people that give out the intellectual awards. These are the people who control much of the mainstream media. And Tom refused to play footsie with them. And he has paid a price for that in terms of prestige, in terms of notoriety. But this started a long time ago. And Tom's response has always been, when I was researching the book, I would often come across these interviews that Tom had given over the decades with people who would often say to him, how does it feel to go against the grain of your fellow Blacks? And Tom would always correct the premise of the question. He'd say, you don't mean I go against the grain of most Blacks. You mean I go against the grain of most Black elites, most Black intellectuals. And Black intellectuals and Black intellectual elites are no more representative of Black people than white intellectuals, and white intellectual elites are representative of whites. And that continues to be the case today, whether you're talking about affirmative action in college admissions, voter ID laws, defunding the police. These are all things where the Black elites find themselves on a different side of the argument based on extensive polling than most Black folks. So, so Tom pointed out something a long time ago that is still happening today. And that is that you have a Black elite. They get on television, they get on cable news today. They're elected to office. They claim to be speaking on behalf of most Black people, but in reality, they're speaking on behalf of themselves.
That insight kind of jumped out at me, and I found myself agreeing partly, but I also had to push back at it slightly, because while obviously if you're a Black author or writer, you can come out and pronounce yourself as representing whoever you want to represent, but Black elected leaders, not universally, but a large amount of them are elected, and they're elected by Black constituents. So Are they not, in a sense, would they be elected if they were not, in essence, reflecting the views of a certain Black constituency that has a more, publicly mainstream view of these topics, as opposed to the Sowellian view?
Well, I guess it would depend on the topic you're talking about. I mean, I'll give you an example. As you know, school choice is hugely popular in the Black community, particularly among Black parents of school-age children. I mean, it pulls off the charts. It always has. Charter schools, voucher programs, school tax credits, you name it. The NAACP opposes school choice, Robert. And Barack Obama spent 8 years as president trying to shut down the DC school voucher program. Why would he do that? He knows the polls, and he's doing that because there are also special interest groups like teachers unions that helped elect him. And so Barack Obama is behaving like a typical politician who pays attention to the special interest groups that helped get him elected.
And Barack Obama has a 90% approval rating among African Americans, right? So
exactly.
So you've got that. You still have that odd tension.
But that's not something unique to Blacks. In other words, this sort of what people vote on. I mean, I'll give you another example. In the 2020 election, there was a ballot initiative out in California about affirmative action, higher education, and it went down quite easily. It was defeated. There was an attempt by liberals to reinstate racial preferences in college admissions in California. It was defeated, and the group leading the charge were Asian Americans who did not want to go back to a system of affirmative action in higher education, which California had up until the mid 1990s when they passed a ballot initiative banning it. Those same Asian Americans who voted overwhelmingly against affirmative action in higher education also voted overwhelmingly for Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. So Blacks are not the only group who can be with a politician on some issues and against that politician on other issues and still cast their vote for that politician. You have to determine what the issue is and what people are actually voting on. I mean, the old joke about Jews is that they earn like Episcopalians and vote like Puerto Ricans. A lot of wealthy people vote for Democrats who are going to raise their taxes and confiscate more of their wealth. So this isn't a uniquely Black phenomenon. Is what I'm getting at.
You just mentioned,
but just empirically, you can go down the list of issues, Robert. Voter ID laws are supported by a majority of Blacks and a majority of whites and a majority of Republicans and Democrats and liberals and conservatives. They are opposed by elites who claim to be speaking on behalf of many of these minority groups. Busing back in the 1970s was supported by groups like the NAACP, whose children, of course, were not on those buses, but they were opposed by everyday Black people in poll after poll after poll. There has long been a disconnect between the claims of these elites and the actual opinions of the constituents they claim to be acting on behalf of. The defund the police stuff is another example of this. In poll after poll, crime control ranks very high in poor Black communities. They want more police, yet the elites are out there claiming otherwise. So this is something that Tom put his finger on a long time ago, and it remains true today.
And to that point, in New York City, Eric Adams is mayor-elect because while the rest of the candidates were running as fast as to the left as they can on issues like defund the police or some variation thereof, the former police officer, who is Black, said, no, that's not going to work. And he got support from many of the Black neighborhoods in New York City and Queens and Bronx. And
he also said he was going to bring back the legal application of stop and frisk. He campaigned on that openly.
Exactly.
And he said we are not going to water down standards at elite high schools so that we can have more racial balance in admissions. I mean, these are all things that progressive politicians have been pushing for, supposedly on the behalf of most Black people.
Exactly. So let's see. We got a lot of things. You mentioned affirmative action in the context of the California proposition from a couple of decades ago. Our esteemed host Kai Bird asked this question. In his 20s, Thomas Sowell was Marxist. Mm-hmm. And today not today, but just only today, but for quite some time, he's opposed affirmative action based on race. Would he support affirmative action based on class, just taking Sowell in his entirety and in his long pathway?
No, he's opposed judging people on anything other than merit. And that's after decades of studying the issue, not only here in the US, but internationally. Thomas studied affirmative action policies all over the world and concluded that they tend to end badly. They're well-intentioned, but we don't need to study what people intend. We need to study what actually happens, and that they have not turned out well. And in many cases, have done more harm than good. Just to use the California example, after California ended race-based admissions back in the mid-1990s, Black and Hispanic enrollment, graduation rates, I should say, Black and Hispanic graduation rates at the flagship universities in the University of California system, Berkeley and UCLA, rose, and not by a little bit. They rose by more than 50%, including in the more difficult subjects of math and science and engineering. So a policy that had been put in place to help increase the ranks of the Black middle class, the number of Black engineers and doctors and lawyers and so forth, had in practice resulted in fewer Black graduates in those disciplines than we would have had in the absence of the policy. So it's not just a matter of affirmative action not doing what proponents say it will do, that is uplifting the Black poor. It's that they have done, these policies have done a tremendous amount of harm. And so Sowell has opposed them both on the basis of race and on the basis of class.
As somebody far wiser than I once said, please stop helping us. For those who don't quite get my really bad joke there, Please Stop Helping Us was actually one of Jason Riley's previous books. And I that clicked because I wanted to ask you, so this is your fourth book. How did the writing of this differ from the previous ones?
Oh, this is my first biography. So it was an entirely different genre for me. I enjoyed it tremendously because I'd been a huge fan of Sowell for a very, very long time. I discovered him in college, or in the early 90s. I worked on the school newspaper and was sitting around having a conversation about affirmative action one day with some colleagues on the paper. And someone said, "Jason, you sound like Tom Sowell." And I said, "Tom who?" And the person wrote down the name of a book on a sheet of paper. And I went to the school library that day and checked it out and read it in one sitting that evening, and went back to school library the next day and checked out the rest of its Tom Sowell collection. Which book was the first book?
It
was Civil Rights, Rhetoric or Reality. It was a book that Sowell wrote in 1984 on the 20th anniversary of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the 30th anniversary of the Brown versus Board of Education decision. And he wanted to assess what the civil rights movement hoped would happen in the wake of those victories and what had actually played out. And so I first got to meet Tom in the mid-90s when I was working at the Wall Street Journal. He would come through New York. He was already based at the Hoover Institution at Stanford, but he would come through New York on book tours every so often. And as you know, he's written a lot of books, so he came through pretty often. And so I first got to meet him in the mid 1990s, and then I went out to Stanford and did a longer profile of him for the paper in the 2000s, and that's when we sort of struck up an acquaintance that has endured. But he had a huge impact on my own personal development. So I very much enjoyed spending a few years delving into Tom Sowell's life. I don't know if the genre is for me. I mean, I'd have to find someone as interesting as I find Sowell, and who has produced so much to get into. I mean, this book could have been twice as long as it was, easily. Twice as long as it has easily been twice as long. But my thinking is that people don't really read books that are longer than about 250 pages. So I try to keep it manageable in that sense. But so that was the biggest difference. I had never set out to chronicle either the actual life or the intellectual life of someone, and that's what made this book different from my others.
Mm-hmm. And by the way, I should remind anybody who's watching, if they've got a question for my esteemed guest, please put it in the chat room, and we'll get to whatever we can get. Whatever we can get to. Have you read every single one of those of those books, or
I have not read every single one. I've read most of, but by my count, he's published 37 standalone books, and then another dozen or so books are collections of columns or new editions or expanded editions of previous works. So they add up to close to 50 altogether, but he's published 36 or 37 original works, 5 since turning 80, Robert. So what are you doing with your life?
I got to agree with and look, and you're already ahead of me for four books to none when I'm spending my time on the comedy stages of New York City. But let's get back to a straightforward biographical question. You said this is a biography of ideas, of Sowell's ideas, but do you have any insights on how his earlier life helped influence his intellectual trajectory? I mean, he was
Sure.
he was born in 1930.
30.
He was born in 1930.
Yeah.
But he served in the Marines, meaning he was also older when he went into college and graduate school and all this other kind of stuff. So that particular experience, how did that help influence his later intellectual pursuits?
Well, as one of the Kai, I think, asked in his question, or noted in his question that Sowell had started out as a Marxist. In his earlier life, he was far to the left, not just slightly left of center, which interestingly is not, it's not only not unique among a lot of conservatives. I mean, Ronald Reagan started on the left, Milton Friedman started on the left, but a lot of Black conservatives not only started slightly left of center, but on the far, I mean, Clarence Thomas was a Black Panther. Walter Williams had views far more sympathetic to those of Malcolm X than of Martin Luther King in his youth. Shelby Steele was a Black radical in the
Clarence
1960s.
Thomas had high praise for Malcolm X.
Yes,
as well.
Yes, exactly. So Tom sort of falls into that mode. There's a man born in the Jim Crow South in North Carolina, outside of Charlotte, 1930, during the Great Depression. Very poor family. Is orphaned as a child. Never knew his father, who died before he was born. And his mother died in childbirth to a younger sibling. And so Tom never knew either of his parents. He was raised by a great aunt who took him in and then moved the family when Tom was about 10 up to Harlem, and where he was raised. He dropped out of high school. He was a bright student, but had a pretty tumultuous home life. So he never received a high school degree, and sort of wandered around for about a decade or so, trying to find himself, taking a lot of menial jobs and so forth. One of which was for the Western Union. He was a messenger for Western Union in New York City in the 1940s when he was a teenager. And his office was located down in the Wall Street area. And he would, after work sometimes, ride a bus back home up in Harlem. So he basically had to traverse the entire island of Manhattan, or almost. And he would ride on this bus, and he would notice how the neighborhoods would change as the bus moved north. You'd go up Fifth Avenue, go past the fancy shopping district, Saks Fifth Avenue, or so forth, to get to Carnegie Hall. Would turn left and then go up Riverside Drive through this fancy residential neighborhood. And then it would cross this viaduct, and there were the tenements where he would get off. And he would say to himself, what just happened? Why does it look like this up here versus where I've started and what I've seen along the way? And he said Marx explained that in terms that he found extremely satisfying. You know, you're being exploited. The proprietors are exploiting the workers and so forth. This is a clash of classes, and Tom absorbed that, and he found it quite persuasive, and he carried that with him throughout his youth, well into his 20s, even after he had studied under these free market stalwarts like Milton Friedman and George Stigler. Sowell was still a Marxist. It was a job in government, he says, that finally got him to rethink his socialism. He was studying minimum wage laws in Puerto Rico and the government's role in those laws while working at the Department of Labor in the early 1960s. And he noticed that a lot of less skilled minorities were being priced out of jobs, and that the government didn't much care and was still going to promote these laws. And it caused Tom to rethink his view of government as this always and everywhere being this benevolent force in the life of the underprivileged. And that's sort of where it started. It was a life experience, had a lot to do with how his thinking changed, as much, if not more so, than actual book learning. He tells another story about working at the U.S. Public Health Service in the 1950s, just as an intern. And he tells the story about working at their headquarters in Washington, D.C. at the time. And just before work ends one afternoon, a man has a heart attack on the sidewalk outside of the building. They bring him inside, but it's determined that because he's not a government employee, he can't be treated in this building. So they take him to the nurse's office. They call for an ambulance to come and take him somewhere where he can be treated. And the man dies before the ambulance arrives. And Sowell says, a man died waiting for a doctor in a building full of doctors. And for him, this sort of dramatized the nature of bureaucracies and putting procedure ahead of results and outcomes and so forth. And there are a lot of stories like that in Tom's life, where he brings a perspective to things based on his unique experience that a lot of his fellow intellectuals and fellow academics don't, because they didn't have that type of experience to draw from. But Tom very much draws from his life experience and his scholarship.
Okay, we are running close on time, so I'm going to finding some questions here from the audience, and I'm going to ask you to try and keep them as tight as possible on the answers, even though these are really good questions. So Fred Schoen asks, given the apparent decline of Hayek/Friedman/Sowell ideas in the current political parties, do you see a comeback of these thoughts, and if so, who might lead it?
Well, I don't know who might lead it, but I do see a comeback eventually at some point, because I think these ideas have been proven empirically to work. I think free markets work better than government control. That I think has just been proven down through history, and so eventually I think you're going to see the pendulum swing back. I think right now, progressives are ascendant, and that type of thinking is ascendant, and socialist ideas are ascendant. But at the end of the day, they don't work. They never worked in the past.
And market and interfering in markets is also on the rise on the right, as well as
But it doesn't matter who's pushing it. If it doesn't work, it doesn't work. And so I think these ideas, the Hayek and Friedman and Sowell ideas, will eventually get a second look, because what we're trying now isn't going to work.
What of Thomas Sowell's many ideas and many writings do you find disagreement with?
Disagreement?
Disagreement.
Not a lot. I mean, I like I said, he's had a huge influence on my thinking in many respects. I mean, even if I was already thinking like Tom, as the anecdote I shared earlier suggested, back in college, I didn't have the vocabulary. I didn't know the history. I didn't have the data to back up what I was thinking. Sowell provided all of that. Tom's probably a little more libertarian than I am on some issues. But no, there's not a lot of disagreement. No fundamental disagreements that I can think of.
Okay. See, from Robert Dannon, what are Sowell's views on religious pluralism, and specifically on African American Islam?
I don't know that I've come across his views on that specifically. I mean, I think he is someone who has seen religion as one of these institutions that helps people in terms of decision making. So he's written about it in the context of writing about social theory, and in books like Knowledge and Decisions and A Conflict of Visions, he's talked about the importance of these institutions in disseminating knowledge throughout society that helps people form decisions, and religions, political organizations, and so forth certainly fall under that category. But no, I haven't come across anything specifically that he's written about religion, and nor have I come across any evidence that he is a particularly religious person himself.
Our brilliant producer, Thad, asks, who's Sowell's chief intellectual mentor?
Well, I think Sowell sees himself acting in the tradition of the classical liberals. Your Adam Smiths, your David Ricardos, your John Stuart Mills, and so forth. In college, his mentors in graduate school were George Stigler and Milton Friedman. They served as his primary mentors at the University of Chicago. When Sowell again was a socialist, and there's an interesting story I tell in the book about how at some point Sowell was running into financial difficulty. He was thinking about dropping out of graduate school and just getting a job because things were getting so tight. And Stigler and Friedman took it upon themselves to go secure a grant for Tom to finish his studies in graduate school. And in their application, they said to the organization where they applied, the foundation where they applied for the grant, they said, he's a socialist now, but he's too smart to stay one. So you should support this guy. But those were his mentors in graduate school, and they obviously saw a lot of promise in him.
Matt Reese asks, was Sowell influenced by the early Black conservative George Schuyler?
You know, Schuyler's name came up quite a bit in my research. I don't know if Sowell was directly influenced by him. I think he saw him as a sort of iconoclast who maybe made Sowell more comfortable becoming one himself. But I don't know if there was a direct influence or that they had a relationship or correspondence. I believe Schuyler reviewed one of Tom's books. I can't recall which one, before he died. I think Schuyler died in the mid-70s, but and had reviewed one of Tom's books. But no, I don't know that there was a direct relationship there. The Sowell was much more influenced by writers like Hayek, if you want to talk about people who are still alive, and of course Friedman and Stigler. He was also had a great deal of respect and wrote a great deal about Black academics like the sociologist E. Franklin Frazier, St. Clair Drake. I mean, John Hope Franklin, folks like that. He didn't always agree with their conclusions, but I think he had a great deal of appreciation of their scholarship, their rigor, their academic rigor, their empiricism, particularly in the point of Frazier, who's a University of Chicago guy himself. And so you see Sowell paying tribute to those guys throughout his writings.
I forget who it was who said it, but you quote somebody in the book who said that, and it might have been Friedman, it might have been Stigler, and again I'm paraphrasing, but something along the lines of that Sowell is as brilliant as any Nobel Prize winner, but he'll probably never win a Nobel himself, which is basically came to be true. Why don't you think, given his extensive research on the economic side, why do you think he's never won a Nobel?
Well, whether it's a Nobel or any of the other, MacArthur Genius Grant, whatever, it's again, he's refused to play footsies with the people who hand out those awards. And I'm not suggesting that everyone who has received those awards has played footsie, but Sowell has really challenged a lot of the orthodox thinking particularly on the racial controversies, and I think that he's been canceled as a result. I mean, and if I could just, one of the reasons we need maverick thinkers like Sowell. I think you take this debate over the 1619 project and the New York Times and Nicole Hannah-Jones and critical race theory. Nicole Hannah-Jones is a journalist who has not published any books about anything, no academic papers about anything. And yet she's given all this deference on American history and the history of slavery in the United States in the 1619 Project. I mean, there's no shortage of books written about American history or slavery, none of them by Nicole Hannah-Jones. So I mean, the people have challenged the facts that she's laid out here, but very few academics have stepped forward, people who know this history, and called her out, or the New York Times out on this, but particularly not Nicole Hannah-Jones. And why is that? Why isn't every head of every history department in America shouting from the rooftops that this is nonsense? That America is not uniquely evil because of its slave past. That this whole idea that the slave economy made America rich has no basis. In fact, that the American Revolution was fought to preserve slavery has no basis. Why isn't everyone who knows something about this subject calling her out on this? It's because they are afraid, Robert. They're afraid of being called a sexist, of being called a racist, and so forth. Sowell was never afraid. And that is what distinguished him. And I think we need 100 more just like him. And now more so than ever. There was a lot of intellectual cowardice going on right now in this country, particularly with regard to racial issues. And Sowell was someone who never, ever backed down. And of course, he has paid a price, including in not receiving these intellectual honors that we're talking about. But that is not what he's about. He's about telling the truth, even when it's politically incorrect. And so that's what makes him a maverick. And like I said, it shouldn't, but unfortunately, that's where we are today, intellectually.
Well, that seems like the perfect place to end this. Jason, thank you so much for the hour. Many thanks to the Leon Levy Center and Shelby White for making this event possible. Once again, the book is The Maverick, a biography of Thomas Sowell. It's by my friend and sometime doppelganger, Jason Riley. With that, good night, everybody. Thank you much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you, Robert.